A king spends 10 years fighting a war. Then it takes him 10 more years just to find his way home. Every single one of his men dies along the way. He is held prisoner by a witch, nearly eaten alive by a monster, and trapped by a goddess who refuses to let him leave her island for 7 straight years. Meanwhile, back home, his own son has grown from a baby into a man, searching the world for any word of a father he barely remembers, while his wife fights off over 100 men trying to force her into marriage. This is not the plot of Christopher Nolan's new film. This is the original story, written down almost 3,000 years ago, that inspired it. Before you see the movie, here is the real Odyssey, the entire story. The Wrath of Poseidon. Our story begins after the fall of Troy, a city that held out against the Greeks for 10 brutal years, only to fall through a trick, a massive wooden horse secretly packed with Greek soldiers that the Trojans themselves dragged inside their own walls. Among the Greek soldiers hidden that night was Odysseus, king of the small island of Ithaca, and the mastermind behind the entire scheme. With Troy finally in ruins, he set sail for home with 12 ships and hundreds of loyal men. Waiting for him are his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, who was just a newborn infant when his father left for war. The journey home should take a matter of weeks. It will take Odysseus another full 10 years, because somewhere along the way he makes a fatal mistake. He angers Poseidon, god of the sea, and a god's anger does not fade quickly and does not forgive easily. While Odysseus struggles across the ocean, back in Ithaca, his household is falling apart. Over 100 suitors have moved into his palace uninvited, certain he is dead, feasting on his livestock, drinking his finest wine, and demanding Penelope choose one of them to marry and hand over the throne. Telemachus, now a young man but with no army and no real authority in his own home, is powerless to throw them out alone. Guided by the goddess Athena, who has always favored his father, Telemachus finally decides to act, sailing off in secret to visit 2 old war heroes who fought alongside his father at Troy, Nestor and Menelaus, desperate for any word of whether his father is alive or dead. From Menelaus, he learns something extraordinary, that the shape-shifting sea god Proteus once revealed Odysseus is indeed alive, but held captive on a distant island by a beautiful nymph, unable to leave. It is the first real proof, after 10 long years of silence, that his father might still come home. Telemachus sails back toward Ithaca changed, no longer a boy waiting for news, but quietly becoming, through that dangerous journey, the man his father will one day need standing beside him. AEOLUS, the LAESTRYGONIANS, and the Cyclops. Odysseus and his men first make landfall on the island of the Lotus Eaters. The fruit there is sweet and dangerous. One taste, and a man forgets home entirely, content to sit on that shore forever, doing nothing else. Odysseus has to physically drag his own drugged crew back to the ships, kicking and pleading, just to keep the voyage alive. Next, hunting for food and water, they stumble into the cave of Polyphemus, a monstrous one-eyed Cyclops, son of Poseidon himself. Trapped inside by a boulder only Polyphemus can move, Odysseus watches in horror as the giant begins eating his men, 2 at a time, smashing them against the cave floor for his meals. Odysseus knows brute force won't save them, so he turns to cunning instead. He offers Polyphemus strong wine, again and again, until the giant is thoroughly drunk and asks his name as thanks for the gift. Nobody, Odysseus tells him. Once Polyphemus finally collapses into a drunken sleep, Odysseus and his surviving men heat a wooden stake in the fire and drive it into his single eye, blinding him instantly. Polyphemus screams in agony for help, howling to his fellow Cyclopes that nobody is attacking him, And hearing this, they simply shrug and walk away, assuming he's lost his mind. It is one of the cleverest escapes in the whole story. But as they sail off to safety, Odysseus makes a second, prouder mistake. He shouts his real name back across the water, boasting of his victory. Now Polyphemus knows exactly who blinded him, and he prays aloud to his father, Poseidon, for revenge, a curse that will haunt every single day of Odysseus's journey from that moment forward. Soon after, the god of the winds, AEOLUS, takes pity on the exhausted travelers and gives Odysseus an extraordinary gift, a leather bag containing every dangerous storm wind in the world, tied shut, leaving only a single gentle breeze free to guide them safely home. For 9 days, it works perfectly. Ithaca is finally in sight. But while Odysseus sleeps, his own curious crew, convinced the bag is secretly full of treasure he is hiding from them, tears it open. Every storm wind bursts out at once, and the ships are blown violently backward, all the way back to AEOLUS's island, who now refuses to help them again, certain they are cursed by the gods themselves. Worse follows immediately after. Landing among the LAESTRYGONIANS, a race of savage giants, the crew watches in horror as these giants hurl massive boulders down from the surrounding cliffs, smashing 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships to splinters and devouring the crews like fish speared from a stream. Only Odysseus's own ship, which he had cautiously kept anchored outside the harbor, manages to escape. In a single afternoon, he has lost almost his entire fleet. Circe, the Underworld, and the Sirens. With just one ship left, the survivors reach the island of AEOLUS, home to the sorceress Circe. She welcomes Odysseus's exhausted men with a warm feast, then waves her wand and turns half of them instantly into pigs. Odysseus, protected by a magical herb given to him by the god Hermes himself, resists her spell entirely and forces her, blade drawn, to reverse the curse on his men. Impressed rather than angry, Circe lets them stay as honored guests, and Odysseus ends up remaining on her island for a full year before his men finally convince him it's time to leave. But Circe tells him one thing must happen before he can safely sail home. He must travel to the underworld itself and speak with the blind prophet Tiresias. In that dark, misty realm of the dead, Odysseus encounters the spirit of his own mother, who died of grief while waiting for his return, and the ghost of the great warrior Achilles, who tells him that he would rather live as the poorest, lowest servant on earth than rule as king over all the dead. It is a haunting warning about the true cost of the glory Odysseus and his men fought so hard for at Troy. Finally, Tiresias himself delivers his critical warning that Odysseus's men must never, under any circumstances, touch the sacred cattle of the sun, god Helios, or none of them will ever see home again. Returning to the world of the living, Circe warns him of the horrors still waiting ahead. First, the Sirens, creatures whose song is so beautiful that sailors steer straight into the rocks trying to reach them and die there by the hundreds. Odysseus orders his men to plug their ears completely with beeswax, then has himself tied tightly to the ship's mast so that he alone can hear the siren's song without being able to act on the temptation. Next comes an impossible choice, a narrow strait guarded on one side by Scylla, a six-headed monster who snatches sailors straight from the deck, and on the other by Charybdis, a whirlpool violent enough to swallow his entire ship whole. Odysseus chooses to pass closer to Scylla and watches helplessly from his own ship as she seizes 6 of his best remaining men, screaming, straight off the deck. Finally, exactly as Tiresias warned, his starving and desperate crew lands on the island of Helios, and against Odysseus's direct pleading, they slaughter and eat the sun god's sacred cattle while he sleeps. Helios is furious and demands justice from Zeus himself. As they finally sail away, A violent storm rips the ship apart at sea. Every single one of Odysseus's remaining men drowns in the wreckage. He alone survives, clinging to a broken plank of wood, utterly alone in open water. Calypso, Nausicaa, and the return home. Washed ashore half dead, Odysseus is found by the beautiful nymph Calypso, who falls deeply in love with him and refuses, for 7 long years, to let him leave her island. 7 years in which Telemachus grows fully into manhood, searching for word of his father across the Greek world, and Penelope holds off her army of suitors with a trick of her own, weaving an elaborate burial shroud by day, promising to finally remarry once it's complete, then secretly unraveling every stitch of her own work each night, so the shroud is never, ever finished. Only when the gods finally intervene on Mount Olympus is Calypso ordered, against her will, to release Odysseus at last. He builds a small raft with his own hands and sails on alone, surviving one final storm sent by the still furious Poseidon, before washing up exhausted and half-drowned on the shore of the Phaeacians. There, a young princess named Nausicaa, out washing clothes with her attendants, discovers the shipwrecked stranger, and rather than fleeing in fear, calmly gives him clothing and leads him to her father's palace. The Phaeacians treat him as an honored guest, hosting feasts and athletic games in his honor, and it's only there, moved to tears by a bard's song about the very war he fought in, that Odysseus finally reveals his true identity and tells his entire incredible 10-year story from beginning to end. Moved by his tale, the Phaeacians agree to finally carry him home to Ithaca aboard one of their fastest ships. But arriving home is not the end of the danger. It's the beginning of the most dangerous part of all. Odysseus knows he cannot simply walk into his own palace. Over 100 armed suitors would kill him instantly, rather than lose their claim to his throne. So, disguised by Athena as a frail, elderly beggar, he slips quietly into his own home, completely unrecognized by everyone inside, except his old, loyal dog, Argos, who, seeing his true master again after 20 long years, weakly wags his tail one final time and dies content. The bow and the slaughter. Penelope, still not knowing the ragged beggar in her hall is her husband, announces one final contest to end the suitors' demands once and for all. She will marry whoever among them can string her husband's old hunting bow and fire a single arrow clean through the aligned handles of 12 lined-up axe heads. One by one, every powerful, arrogant suitor steps up and fails, unable even to bend the bow enough to string it, and each humiliating failure only fuels the room's growing anger and mockery. Then the disguised beggar quietly asks for his own turn. The suitors laugh and mock him openly for his arrogance. Odysseus strings the bow as easily as breathing, barely a flicker of effort crossing his weathered face, and fires the arrow in one motion perfectly through all 12 axes. Before the stunned suitors even understand what is happening, he turns the bow on them instead, knocking a second arrow. With his son Telemachus fighting bravely at his side and the doors barred shut behind them, Odysseus kills every single suitor in his own great hall, ending 20 years of humiliation and theft in one violent, bloody afternoon. Only then does he finally reveal his true identity to Penelope, who, cautious and guarded after everything she has endured alone, tests him with one last secret trick that only the real Odysseus could possibly answer correctly, a detail about their marriage bed that no stranger could ever have known. Satisfied at last that her husband has truly returned, she runs to embrace him, 20 years of grief and waiting finally breaking at once. Yet even now, peace is not fully secured. Furious families of the slaughtered suitors rise up in the streets of Ithaca, arming themselves and marching on the palace, demanding vengeance of their own. A second bloody civil war seems ready to tear the island apart. Only the direct intervention of the goddess Athena herself, descending to force a truce between both sides, finally ends the cycle of violence for good. 20 years after first leaving for war, Odysseus is finally, truly, and peacefully home. Nearly 3,000 years after it was first told aloud by traveling poets, with no book, no writing, only memory and voice passed down from storyteller to storyteller, the Odyssey remains one of the most retold stories in human history. For centuries, most scholars assumed Troy itself was pure invention, a beautiful myth with no real city behind it at all. Then, in the 1870s, a wealthy amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, following clues buried in the old poems themselves, dug into a mound in modern-day Turkey and uncovered the genuine layered ruins of an ancient city that had been destroyed by fire, in roughly the very era the legends describe. Nobody can say for certain that Odysseus himself ever existed, but the world he sailed through, it seems, may have been very real indeed. That is the complete tale Christopher Nolan is now bringing to IMAX screens this July, in theaters everywhere. Now, when you watch it, you'll already know exactly where every twist, every monster, and every impossible choice truly began. If you enjoyed this journey through one of the greatest stories ever told, subscribe to History Max for more of the myths and history behind the biggest stories on screen.